I'm going to go ahead and get started. My name is Brad Westfall, and I haven't had a chance to really look at my slides since I made them, really, because I've been busy with a lot of things. So yeah, we'll see how this goes. Hopefully it'll be good. If you guys want to follow along the slides, there's the bit.ly URL right there. There'll also be at the end. It's been really fun planning CSS Day, so I hope you guys are enjoying yourself. All right, so my talk is about the difference between layout and components. I've always liked to use this analogy the best, that layout is like a bookshelf and components are like the things that get to move around on the bookshelf that are not asphyxiated to a particular place of layout. So that's kind of my go-to. So this conference is about programmers learning to kind of level up in CSS. And I kind of feel like if you're a programmer, you kind of go through this basic process where everyone starts off with really simple things and then they get high quality code as they move on. Hopefully the more you do this, the longer you spend time doing computer sciences, you don't get worse at doing code. So I feel like somewhere in the middle something special happens. And I think that that's something special is design patterns, if you're a programmer. If you've ever studied design patterns as a programmer, you know that it triples your game immediately as soon as you start to get it. So that's actually the same thing that happens in CSS. CSS also has design patterns, and when I see beginners kind of start to conquer CSS, they're not using a lot of the patterns and they're struggling a lot, and then once they start to learn the patterns, they get really good really fast. And there's only a few patterns to learn in CSS. So on the left-hand side, we've got the coder patterns like singleton and factory and the if pattern for JavaScript. And this is just the short list, if you will. There's really good naming of patterns in JavaScript and other programming languages. But it seems like CSS, we have lots and lots and lots of patterns, but none of them have any names, except for there's one called media object. And besides that, there's lots of patterns, but they're kind of nameless. And so we're going to kind of give some names here in this talk. But yeah, I kind of feel like it's hard to have a conversation about CSS sometimes because of the lack of the names of the patterns. So we're going to talk about these three big points first in terms of strategy. So know the patterns, we're going to talk about that, and we're going to talk about developing from the outside in. Jonathan Snook talked about that a little bit. And also, I want you to try to think about where the hidden lines are, because that's a big concept in doing layout, okay? So these are the types of things in CSS that are easy to understand in theory. I'm sure you're looking at these three things going, oh yeah, I got it. Very, very, very difficult in practice. I still make big mistakes in CSS, and I learn from them, and that's the best way to learn. So the first pattern I want to introduce is probably the most popular pattern, except for it doesn't have a name until right now, right? I call it the double container pattern. And all my students who I teach know what the double container pattern is. But the double container pattern is this pattern where you have two containers, exactly two containers. And the inner container, you have margin auto and a width. And margin auto centers a block level element within its block level container. So that's how we get things centered in web design. If you've ever seen this margin zero auto and wondered what that was all about, the auto is only going to work on the left and right. And so in margin, when you have two values, the first value applies to top and bottom, next two values apply to, or the next value applies to left and right. So the margin zero is just saying we don't really need to say margin auto on top and bottom, because that doesn't make any sense. It doesn't do anything anyways. So I've got this website here, and I've added a beard and crossed out the name to disguise who it is. So we'll just say this is a speaker, but I won't say which one, okay? So it turns out that this particular website was also developed with a double container pattern. In fact, most websites that have a centered website context are developed with this pattern. And in most cases, the double container pattern is one big container for the whole website, and that really works out really well when the sides, the curtains, if you will, if you're talking kind of TV lingo, are one uniform color or design. So that works out really well for a site like this. But sometimes you need multiples of these double container patterns stacked on top of each other, and you're going to need that when the double container patterns have different colors and different designs. So for instance, this is the infamous Puppy Love project that we do at our bootcamp, and all of our students have designed this. They all have to design this at week 3 or so, and it kind of kicks their butt, right? It's a big deal to be able to pull off all this stuff after only learning CSS for about 3 weeks. It turns out that this is my first opportunity to show them, hey, there's some of these hidden lines here, you see. Everything is going to align to these edges. It's not just arbitrary. And so since you have those edges, but since we also have the backgrounds and stuff that go more or less to the viewport edge with different colors, we're going to need 2 double container patterns to pull this off. Okay, so there you go. There's some context for stacking these on top of each other. And so as you can see, we're going to need to be able to see like those hidden lines to be able to know when we need these types of patterns. So here's GitHub. I'm pretty much going to use this GitHub page a lot in this talk for example purposes and also the Puppy Love project. So when you're looking at this site, I'm not sure what the first thing you see is, but when I develop sites, I develop from the outside in, and that's always a really important concept to work from the outside in. So you might be thinking, like, let's start working on like the 2 columns, because those are seem like they're the most outside thing. But not so fast. We have these edges right here, and then we have these 2 colors right here. It turns out that the very first thing that you need before you get into this section right here is you need to do the double container pattern stacked on top of each other again for 2 of them. And as it turns out, I looked at the source, and this is exactly how GitHub does their stuff. Okay, and so this is where working from the outside in is really important. I have to continuously tell my students, nope, you didn't quite go outside enough. We need to really start from that outer edge. So that's really important. You don't want to develop the inside of the parts of the website first. I know that the components are like the fun part, right? That's like the slam dunk, but you got to remember to dribble before you get to that point, okay? All right, so we're going to talk about negative margin tricks because they are also pretty important for layout. And in the last talk, the Flexbox talk that we had, Chris talked about some negative margin stuff, and that kind of made me excited because I was like, yes, I'm not going to be the only one. It's like negative margins are like really important, and not a lot of people know how to use them correctly. So let's say we're going to build something like this. Now I got this design off of Dribble. Just tried to find something that I was going to be able to use negative margins for. So look at these tiles. Notice how the picture kind of goes all the way to the edge of the tile, but notice how the content underneath it, it has kind of like space around it, right? It's got like, well, padding or margin or whatever. So basically our goal here on the left is the image with the text that is kind of like not touching the edge, right? And so we're gonna do like this in progress on the right-hand side, and you'll see how we can build this. So I think that idea 1 is you can take your image and you can give it no margin, and then you can take this text and you can give it some margin, and that's perhaps how beginners would solve this. The problem is, as you start to add more and more items into this lower area, buttons and whatever, all of a sudden it's an endless game of what needs margin and what doesn't need margin. And we're also going to talk about how components, I don't want you to put margin on the outer edge of components to begin with. We're going to talk about that later on. So I don't like this idea at all. It's kind of like an endless game of adding more and more CSS as you need to add more content. The second idea is, what if we did padding on this container? Well, okay, this is an interesting idea. It kind of solves like the buttons and the text down here not needing to have their own independent margins, and so they can just live in that space and everything's going to work out great. But now the problem is the image is not exactly touching the edge of the container. Idea 3, which is probably the more popular way to solve this, is let's just add another container down at the bottom. Has anyone done that before to solve this sort of thing? Okay, I'm seeing like half the room raises their hands. This is the wrong way to do it. Okay, this was a way that I did it for a while too until I understood negative margins for this particular type of design more recently. And the reason why this is the wrong way to do it, so here's like the next slide, so you can add some padding to that and so on and so forth. The reason why this is the wrong way to do it is because I'm going to show you a solution that requires less DOM elements, and if you can never do something in pure CSS without adding more DOM elements, generally considered the better way to do it. Okay, so what if we go back to that idea too? Remember the one where there was the padding with the image not quite going to the edge? So we've already solved all the text and the buttons and all that other stuff at the bottom. We pretty much just needed to solve the image, right? So it turns out with this image right here, with it being inside of that padding context, it turns out you can do negative margins on the top, right, and left, and it will pull that image outside of its containing context. And so you can pull that up to this area with negative margin. Obviously, the negative margin is going to be the same amount as padding as there was on the container. So it's an interesting idea, right? So this is a way to do this. So there's one context of negative margins. And so this is pretty much what we get, the end result. The goal now matches the end result. Okay, so here's another example of how to use negative margins. We're going to solve this gutter right here. Turns out that gutter right there is not very easy to solve. I know you're thinking, just put margin in between them. Well, it's not so fast, okay? So the idea is we want to have a gutter right there, but we also want to have these two columns line up to the header, which is above them. And that's going to cause a problem, because what you're going to start off with is you're going to start off with two columns like this, and they're going to be butted up next to each other. Let's go ahead and just kind of pretend like we're making our own grid system here. So each column has a class called column, and then there's span 3, span 9. And so let's say we're using like a flow left kind of strategy on the columns, so the two columns are next to each other. By the time you add this margin left and right of 10 pixels, you're going to get this. You're going to get the left column is going to have some extra margin over here, and it's not going to quite touch the left edge of the header. And yeah, you can do tricks for like, first child, last child, or whatever, but if you're making a grid system, chances are those tricks are going to start to fall apart at some point. So we want to have a really reusable thing like the column class, and so we're going to have flow left, margin left of 10 pixel, and it's going to cause this problem. So it turns out that anytime you have something side by side with something else, you always need a container for that. So there's seeing the hidden lines. If you're looking at what I have in green right now, you might be thinking, okay, we're looking at 3 div tags. When I look at this, or whatever tags, when I look at this right here, I see 4 things. Because anytime you have stuff side by side, you always need a container to contain them. So that's going to be called row. So we're going to take row, and we're actually going to do negative margin, and we're going to pull it to the outer edges, and that's going to make it line up with the header again. So that's pretty much how grid systems work, is they have basically just something like this. I mean, you can make most grid systems in less than 10 or 15 lines of CSS. So anyways, I have a code pin on this. So if you go through the slides, you can click on that icon, and you can see the code pin on how this works. And then you can take out the negative margin, put it back in, kind of see how that works. Okay, so it turns out that there was one more thing missing from that whole algorithm that we just talked about that would make that work. And that's this calc function that is also kind of, I wouldn't say it's misunderstood, I would say it's just flat out unknown by a lot of people doing CSS. So this is also really important. Let me show you how this works. So we have our 2 columns, and they add up to 100% because the span 3 is 25 and the span 9 is 75%. Okay, so far so good. So you take this column and you add some margin to it like this, and you get margin on both sides. But this isn't exactly what we get, right? What happens when you take 2 things that add up to 100% and you give them more of a width with margin, right? The box model, the margin factors on the outside of the width, even if you're doing things like box sizing. So this isn't really what happens. This is what happens. Have you guys gotten this before, right? This is pretty common. So what we're going to do then is notice the width was 25%, 75%. What if we said that the width was 25% minus 20 pixels? That's the new width of the green column on the left. And the 20 pixels comes from 2 of the margins. Make sense? Okay, so this is how most grid systems work, is they need this calc trick, and then of course we got that, remember going back to that previous example, this is going to be in a container, and we're going to do a pull like that, and that's how you get 2 columns with a gutter that actually go to the outer edge. Okay, it's actually a lot of magic there. So, all right, so that's pretty much it. Those are the first 3 slides. The next concept, this is kind of funny because I used to call this approach that I used to do called the Jamaicanized approach. And then I started teaching at the boot camp, and I started mentioning it to the students, and they kind of like took it on their own. And now it's almost like a term that we have just in like our little group of students. And so I might as well show it to you. It's actually kind of funny. So we're designing this thing called Puppy Love, and the first thing they're going to make is these double container patterns on the outside. And what I encourage the students to do is don't go for the home run. Don't go for this thing on the right away. The first thing you should do is make it look more like this. Because if you give everything an obnoxious background color, and you're probably going to use color words because they're easier to remember than the hexes, obviously. So by the time you use black and green and blue and yellow and stuff, it kind of takes on this kind of, Jamaicanized look, I guess. So, so there you go. That's where it comes from. So by doing this, you can see the lines that are around like the great people, better dogs. You can see how that all works. So, anyways, this is it. So I encourage them to do that, and it really helps to develop seeing the lines, and it also helps you work from the outside in. The other thing I wanted to talk about is, and I'm glad that this is starting to become a popular concept. I just heard Hayden Pickering talk about this the other day, or tweet about this. He's kind of a famous CSS guy from out of the UK. And the height property is toxic. It's something that you can use a little bit, but if you use it a lot, you're probably doing things wrong. I tend to use the height property on that puppy love project. I think the height property gets used like 2 or 3 times on the whole thing. Okay, so let's build this navigation section at the top of the project. First mistake, you gave the navigation a height. Okay, that's the first mistake, because now you have these anchors, and I gave the anchors background colors of red so you can kind of see like what's going to happen. Now that you've given this height to the container, you're going to have to do something to move these things down to center. And I understand Flexbox now might kind of solve this problem with vertical centering, but it turns out that vertical centering was like the hardest thing to do in CSS for like 20 years. So without Flexbox, you might add top margin to this. Okay, but what top margin? 9 pixels because it happens to put these anchors right in the middle of those 2 lines? Okay, what happens if you want to change the font size? Now the 9 pixels doesn't work out anymore. What happens if you want to change the height of the 65 pixels? Like the boss says, I mean, when does the boss ever want you to make a small change like this, right? No, 65 is not enough, let's go with 85. Now the anchors don't line up. So it's I don't like to set up any concept or any scenario where if I change a little visual thing, I have all the CSS math going on. This is what I call CSS math. I don't think the calc thing I showed you earlier is CSS math. That's like the proper way to do CSS math. I think of CSS math as I'm going to get all the numbers to add up to what I want them to. Because then as soon as one thing changes, the numbers don't add up anymore. Okay, so that's a problem. So this also creates a really fun game called Let's Guess Where the Link Is. You guys ever played this game where you're like fat fingering like a phone, and you're like, I'm like in between it, how come it's not clicking? And only the rectangular area just around the words is clickable, and none of the other space is clickable, so you end up getting like the arrow in the middle. So a better way to do this is to give these anchors padding, and because they're inline elements don't like padding. They do funny things with padding, so you're going to want to make them inline block and then give them some padding. And it's usually common, at least for me, to do a little bit more padding on the left and the right than on the top and bottom. So this is going to solve a lot of problems. For one, we no longer have that game of guessing where the link is because it's a big fat link. Okay, because we have this as an end result, but we have all this space as a clickable area. Also notice we don't have to give the height to those 2 lines, to the nav bar, because its height is now determined by the padding space. And we get the centering concept, vertical centering concept, by virtue of the padding instead of an actual height, and then having to deal with top margins and all that stuff. Okay? Okay, so this talk is going a lot faster than I thought it was. I developed like 110 slides, and we're like buzzing through it. So maybe I'll slow down a little bit. Component independence. So most of that was about layout. Now we're going to talk about the books that go on the shelf. So let's say you're doing GitHub's website, and you got to this point, and you're super proud because you did your columns and you did your negative margins to get all this working right, and you're ready to make your first component. So the first thing you do is you go over to the I was going to show you. These are let me back up. These are the components, right? Components are the books on the shelf. And so you know what? Actually, this was one of those mistakes because I didn't practice my slides because I've been planning CSS Day. So we're going to get to that in 1 second. Sorry about that. So the components are reusable pieces of UI. That's really key, reusable. Sometimes people think this component's not ever going to be used again, so I get to break some of these rules. And every time I break one of those rules for myself, I regret it. I usually have to go in and implement my own set of harsh rules and make sure I'm following them correctly. So layout areas hold the components, right? This is really, really important. Components and layout have almost nothing to do with each other. And that's what we're going to talk about next. So we're going to talk about this rule. Does anyone know what this rule is on top? Does anyone know what object-oriented CSS is? Okay, I'm glad that like 1,000 people didn't raise their hands for that one, because this is one of the only 2 rules of object-oriented CSS. So if you know what object-oriented CSS is, it was developed by Nicole Sullivan around 2010, I want to say. And she was, I think, one of the first people to ever popularize a really big methodology. And then Jonathan Snook came along and popularized SMAX, which kind of depends on some of these concepts. And one of her rules is separate layout from components. One of those things that you read and you go, okay, I'll do that. Really easy to think about, really easy in theory, really difficult in practice. And I'm going to show you why. And I'm going to show you by telling you a little story about Emmett, but not that Emmett. We're going to talk about this Emmett. So have you seen the Lego movie, right? It's a really good movie. This character Emmett, he does his thing and he kind of saves the world. So I'm going to totally give away the movie if you haven't seen it. So in the last talk I heard Jonathan do a few months ago, he also said, like, I'm not going to do an analogy for Legos because it's been overdone. And I thought, I'm going to do an analogy for Legos. So I'm glad he did that again earlier today. All right, so I'm not going to talk about the Lego bricks and how they're modular necessarily. I actually want to talk about the resistance. Okay, I want to talk about this piece that he carries around on his back. So it turns out the movie goes like this. He ends up finding this thing called the resistance, and he doesn't really know what it is. He just knows that it's like the thing that he's going to use to save the day. He spends the whole movie trying to find the bad guy, and basically, when you get to the end of the movie, it turns out, and they didn't tell you this until the very end, that there's this thing called the Craggle, and it's like this crazy glue. And it's called the Craggle because there's like letters missing, and so when you spell out crazy glue without the right letters, you get Craggle. So there's this like bad guy, and it turns out that the whole point of the whole movie is that he's going to glue, or the bad guy is going to glue all the Lego pieces together, and that's going to make Legos, of course, less modular. And so that immediately got me thinking, Lego Movie is about CSS. It is, right? We don't want to glue things together. We want things to be modular. But that's what I see a lot of people doing is they glue things together in an incorrect way. So I'm going to show you where you're putting glue in your CSS, okay? So this is what we're going to do. We're going to save the day, and we're going to be on our huge radio. So separate containers from content. What she was doing when she wrote this was she was predicting the Lego movie. I think Nicole Sullivan actually helped with the Lego movie. She was like, listen, we have this concept, separate containers from content, and we need to make sure people don't glue things together. You're going to make a movie about it. We're going to disguise it as Legos. So it turns out that words have changed over time, and I like to use layout from components instead of containers and content, but it's all kind of the same thing. Okay, so here's where I thought I was before when I was showing you this thing. Sorry. So let's say you're here and you're working on GitHub and you're all proud and you got to this spot and you're like, all right, we're gonna make our first component. Of course, we don't want that component to touch the outer edges of the wall here, so we're gonna put some green padding. The green dotted line is like the padding, and we've got our first component and we're like, all right, good to go. Okay. Then you go to design your second component, and you put it right here and you think, all right, well, I need to have a little bit of a gutter between the first and the second component, so I'm gonna add some margin in there. And that's where the glue is, okay? Because what's gonna happen is you need to copy this layout CSS for your next page, or not copy it, but it's probably in a templating system, but you know what I mean. Like you're gonna reuse the layout for the next page, and perhaps the image isn't gonna be on the next page. And so what you're gonna end up getting is you put margin top 10 pixels on this component, and then the component now has to carry along this baggage of having margin top everywhere it goes. And what if this component ever needs to live somewhere else? It's like always carrying this baggage along with it. So that's not good. Okay, so this pattern at the bottom, this is the media object pattern that I was talking about. This is the Nicole Sullivan's poster child of object-oriented CSS. And anyone who's ever studied CSS is like, Jan, we've been talking about this for like almost 10 years. But for those of you who haven't seen it, anytime you have a graphic on the left and the content on the right, that is pretty much the media object pattern. It can be solved with floats, it can be solved now with flexbox, it can be solved with inline block, it can be solved with lots of different implementations. So I'm not saying that margin is bad. Obviously you're gonna need to use margin like inside of the component to like separate its inner parts from each other. What I'm saying is all components have like an outer shell to them, like that main container that is like the outer part of the component. And I'm saying that we probably shouldn't do margin on that, at least maybe not in a direct way. We're gonna do it in an indirect way, but not this way. We're not gonna just take that component, do all the CSS for it, and then say, hey, component, also have some top margin because we need that right now, and I'm not thinking about tomorrow and I'm gonna need you somewhere else. So, so that's bad, and that's the glue right there. Okay, so there's another strategy, which I also don't like, which is let's design this component independently. So there's the independent CSS for the component starting at line 5. And then somewhere in your CSS, you might say, well, if the component is inside of the aside, then it gets this margin top. So now this component can live somewhere else, and it doesn't have margin top, so you've kind of removed that glue. But this leads to this problem right here, an endless task of every single time you move around components into new layout sections, you always have to go and write up all the CSS to give them their top margin in that context. And this has been shown to be somewhat of an anti-pattern to design your components and then to contextualize them into a certain layout by giving them margin top. Okay? All right, so this is another thing. What if you design like a button, and this is like basically exception hell, where you say, well, if the button is inside of the aside, it has a margin top. If the button is inside of the nav, it's inside of header, it's going to be margin top again, margin right. So does anyone ever do this exception hell, where you design a component and then you continuously have to contextualize it? So this is the anti-pattern that I'm talking about, especially as it pertains to margin. And why margin? Because margin is the gutters concept that we want, right? We want things to have space around them. That's gutters. So this is just the biggest violator, I guess. So this leads to my favorite implementation pattern of 2015 called the lobotomized owl. It's called the lobotomized owl because it looks like two owl eyes and a nose. And this is a selector. It's the asterisk and the plus sign and the asterisk. And this was also developed by Hayden Pickering, the guy I mentioned earlier. So here's how it works. Let's say we have our green layout section, and we want to put 3 components inside of it. Well, because the layout section is going to have padding, the first component already has a gap here at the top, so we don't have to solve that. It's basically every element, every child of the layout, except for the first one, needs top margin. So this CSS over here to the right does that. With this, we can say the container, anything that's a first child, so you're going after anything that's directly inside of the green, basically go after any siblings that are after you and give them margin top. So basically, everything that has a sibling before it, as long as it's a direct child of the container. So I know you might be thinking, asterisks. How do we feel about asterisks? Yeah? No? Okay. So it turns out that a lot of people have this idea that asterisks are slow, and I really feel that comes from SQL, where select all from table is considered bad. You want to specify exactly what you want. So I feel like it was the database crowd that kind of influenced that the asterisk wildcard is this slow pattern. It turns out that the asterisk is not slow in CSS unless it's used in certain contexts. But notice that with these combinators here in the middle, that we're basically saying, as long as everything has something that came before it, and as long as that thing is a direct child of the container, so it's actually pretty fast to use. And I've used this in production sites, and it works out pretty well. So I don't think you should be afraid of it. I know it's kind of complicated looking, but I think it's cool. All right, so there you go. Everything that has a direct child of the container except for the first one. Great. Okay, so here we're going to get to this rule that I have. Don't combine 2 layout concepts into one element. So I'm actually really glad that Jonathan Snook actually talked about that earlier today. He said don't have one element kind of share the rules of 2 different components. And so that's kind of what I'm talking about, just in a little bit more of a layout concept. I think his was a little bit more of a component concept. So let's say we have this double container pattern, and the HTML for it looks like this. We have panel, and then we have the inner div. And let's say we want to divide up this space into 2 columns. Well, you remember how when we have 2 columns, we want to have that class called row? Remember that thing that we're going to do the negative margin on, right? Okay, so it might be really, really tempting to piggyback the double container concept div tag, this one right here, with giving it a class of row. And then, of course, these 2 divs called columns are the 2 blue columns. But this actually won't work out. If you tried doing this, it wouldn't work at all, because what are we doing on that inner div, the inner div of the double container pattern, to make it centered? We're doing margin auto on the sides. Okay? So here's the pattern for the panel inner div. We're doing margin auto, and then you're going to come along and give it a class of row, which does that negative margin concept for that other pattern. You see what I'm talking about? We can't recycle that same div tag for the 2 different concepts. So we're going to talk about another version of not using the same element for 2 different layout concepts. Let's say you're making tiles. And it doesn't really matter to me if you're making float tiles or if you're doing like flex box style tiles. Either way, you're going to need a container, okay? So if you're doing floats, then you're going to need a clear fix. If you're doing flex box, you're going to need a display flex. So you're going to need this container for your tiles no matter what. So let's just imagine that for the next few examples, this is our HTML. Pretty simple. The container is called tiles. It just has divs inside of it. Okay, so let's put this inside of GitHub. I know GitHub doesn't really have tiles like this, but let's just say that we were doing that. So there's our container, there's our tiles. We're gonna put it kind of on the right-hand side of this section, which means we're gonna have something here on the left-hand side, which means we need to have some sort of container, okay? So let's say you come along and you're not really using a grid system and you have some container that you named, and then you have the stuff on the left, and then you have the tiles on the right. So keep in mind that this right here is supposed to be the container for those tiles. This is the bad thing that you just did. This is basically reusing tiles for two different concepts, because what you just did is you're using the tiles container for a layout concept and also for a component concept, and I'm gonna explain why. So let's say this is what you got going on. Here's our like flex example where the tile and the stuff are flex one, and so they're kind of splitting the difference. Or you can do like a float example. What if we floated tiles? You see how tiles is float left with 50%? What if we wanted to move tiles somewhere else? It's going to come along with all that baggage, all that glue, right? Because now that tiles live somewhere else, we don't want it to be in a float context. See what I'm saying? Okay, so here's the deal with this, this container, because it's really easy to think of some of these containers as, is it layout or is it the components? Because the blue things are the components, so what is the container? You guys ever have that thought? Because I've had that thought a lot lately, and here's what I've decided. The tiles are not a part of layout, okay? Because they can't be a part of layout because if you give them layout types of properties, then they're going to be immovable when you want to move them around. So they're not a part of layout. The tiles is actually a form of component into itself. I'll talk about that. And it needs to be able to move around with independence for the same reasons I just talked about. Tiles is a component that holds other components. Okay, so you can have components hold other components. Think Brad Frost has a really interesting concept where he thinks of all CSS as being either atoms or molecules or organisms, and it kind of works bigger, so the small things make the bigger things. Okay, so the tile's subcomponents can't survive without the container. So let me explain what's going on here. Remember when I said we shouldn't glue components to their layouts? Well, the black box is not layout. So we're not gluing the components to them by having the components be like flow left and then you can do like a clear fix on the outside. Okay, so we're getting to the punchline here. The components and this rectangle, this container, have a relationship. And I like to call it a component collection. And I think that's a perfect term because if you really look at it, you're going to be using models to define each of the blue things, right? Those are like single records in the database. And what is the word that we use for a group of models? Collection. So it actually turns out really nice. So I call that a component collection. And component collections are in and of themselves components. Okay? So let me show you the better solution. Let's not treat component collections as, let's treat component collections as components and not combine them with other layout sections. So here's that split that we did a second ago where we, maybe now that we're using a grid system, we can do, some layout stuff with this div tag, the one that's in red. But then let's put this tiles inside of it. And I know it adds up to more DOM, but this really is the right way to do it because now green is completely movable to other areas and it's not glued to any particular layout. Okay, so CSS has lots of interesting programming concepts. I believe that CSS has separation of concerns. We talk about separation of concerns in terms of like JavaScript and CSS and HTML. Like they should be separated, or maybe they shouldn't be. With React and stuff going on. But within JavaScript, there's separation of concerns, right? That's what MVC is. MVC is a separation of concerns concept. Loose coupling and tight coupling, that's a separation of concerns kind of concept. The singularity principle basically means in programming that any function or algorithm should just do one thing and one thing only and do that one thing really, really well. Well, I think that's true of CSS for all the reasons I just told you. Let's have the tiles do one thing really, really well. Let's let the layout do what it wants to do. Let's not mix the concepts. And if you are mixing the concepts, then you are doing tight coupling in CSS, and that's not good. So pretty much, yeah, go with those. Modularity also is not self-explanatory. This was not really a quote, but something I remembered someone saying at the last conference I went to. Modularity, and especially CSS modularity, is a conversation in your team. It's not something that someone can just look at all your CSS and go, oh, okay, I get it. It needs to be documented. So make sure you're having a conversation with your team about how you want to do it. And that's pretty much my talk, probably the fastest talk of the day. Thank you very much.